Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you, Dr. Paul?
Doing fine today.
Good.
Want to talk about the Middle East once again, and Iran, and the national security strategy that just happened. And of course, we talked about that before it was issued and anticipated some of the things that wouldn't be there, and that we wouldn't have all the answers. But I do want to touch on one part of that, and that deals with what were the sentiments directed toward Iran. And it wasn't like they were opening the door to friendship. You know, it was the same old thing. It was almost like Nikki Haley wrote it.
Yeah.
And she's been bashing Iran for a long time. And they're far from an ideal nation, but I don't see that as the job of the United States, is to iron out all the imperfections of all the countries in the world, especially if we have one or two imperfections ourselves. And that's my beef, that we can, as American citizens, we have an obligation, moral obligation, to look to ourselves to see what we can do. And I think we contribute to so much problem. And I don't see much improvement in policy. They really condemn Obama for doing the one thing that we were satisfied with to a large degree, and that was, trying to calm the rhetoric down and try to back off on this inevitable war that they talk about. But we're back at this again, and Trump is all for it, and he goes along with his rhetoric. He set it into campaign. He's saying it now, and it fits the coalition, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the neocons here at home, the military-industrial complex, probably even the issue of the dollar, because countries that don't want to use our dollar, they can get into some trouble. So there are a lot of things pointing, but this is one thing Trump has been consistent on. It's in the report, and it looks like Nikki Haley is having her way and having a big say in this administration.
Yeah, and this goes to a Wall Street Journal report earlier this week, suggesting that President Trump is considering whether he will repurpose the troops that are in Syria. We've just admitted we've got 2,000 troops, probably means we've got double that. Whether he'll repurpose those troops now that ISIS is gone, because the whole justification for them being there was that ISIS is a threat, repurpose them toward confronting Iran, because the U.S. is seeking to prevent Iran from cementing its military presence in Syria. So this is essentially what they're considering doing. Of course, this brings up the issue of, why is Iran in Syria? Well, it's because the U.S. was trying to do regime change. The U.S. was funding indirectly or directly ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other radical groups there. So it's a problem because we created the problem. The other problem is that Syria is a sovereign state and the U.S. troops are there illegally. So what do you do? If this is indeed the case, what do you do?
Well, I have a suggestion. Ask the Syrians what they would like. And there is a Syrian government. We're trying to overthrow it, less so now than we did years ago, but that's really our position. But if you ask the government of Syria, they've invited the Russian assistance, their allies. Russia has a base in Syria, so they've been invited in. But the Iranian troops that are there, nothing like the involvement we have, but the Iranian troops were welcomed by the Syrian government. And guess what? Can you believe it? The Syrian government has asked us to leave, but we don't listen to that. What we do is we demonize the people who are acting against our wishes, even though the argument for that doesn't hold water, this whole thing. But I think the demonizing and the need to make Iran the enemy is a very serious thing, and someday this may just get out of control, and it may be over Syria, because the Iranians aren't going to move those troops out. Okay. And there's going to be, which means that although ISIS has been defeated, thanks to a lot of what the Russians were doing. Yeah. But with our presence there, against the wishes of others, I can assume, I believe correctly, that there will always be an antagonism, a hatred toward our troops. Foreign troops invading and occupying a country when they're not wanted is an incitement to strike out, and of course that means terrorism, terroristic attacks where people even use suicide terrorism in order to make their point if they get tired of the American troops there. But that's been ongoing. That's been 10 years. That problem has existed, and I don't think it's gone away because of a token victory for Assad in Syria right now.
And this is what we talk about all the time, which is that it's our interventionism that creates the problem that they want more interventionism to fix. The reason Iran is in Syria is because of the destabilization of the Syrian government. But so that wouldn't be the case. We wouldn't need to keep troops there because Iran wouldn't be there. But as a sovereign state, part of your sovereignty is you have the right to choose your allies. Syria has chosen its allies, Iran and Russia. It's asked them to come in and help them defeat these radical terrorists, radical jihadists, and they've done that. So it's really the odd man out is the U.S. You know, how does the U.S. justify staying and justify violating the sovereignty of Syria? It says because, well, Iran might be a threat. Well, can you imagine if another country put its troops maybe on the border with Germany because we had bases there and saying we will not let the U.S. consolidate its positions in Western Europe? You know, it wouldn't be stood for.
Well, what if somebody tried to do that in the Gulf of Mexico, like we do in the Persian Gulf or the South China Sea or in Mexico? Our reaction, but to ask our government or the American people to think about that it's too difficult because they start with the premise that we can do no wrong and that we are superior and we have a moral responsibility because of our greatness and our goodness that we're absolutely on the moral high ground. So you can't, it's very difficult to argue the case. Sometimes it's best probably to argue the impracticality of it. But, you know, Haley and Haley's war gets support. She tried to get it from the UN, didn't work so well. She certainly gets it from Trump and our government. She gets it for the support from Israel, but she gets tremendous support for this effort from Saudi Arabia. And of course they have to, in this process, they have to bash the Yemenis for, you know, attacking Saudi Arabia. I mean, just think of what those Yemenis are doing. They're actually shooting missiles and shooting and trying to chase away and chase out the Saudis, and they're the ones who are the aggressors, according to the Haleys, who argue this case for a war against Iran.
And we've had a picture up a couple times of Nikki Haley's big press conference at Bolling Air Force Base, which probably not coincidentally is the home of the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is who should be doing this rather than an ambassador. But she has this remnants of this missile that she says the Iranians gave to the Houthis to fire into Saudi Arabia, and this justifies our war footing toward Iran. But there are a few problems with what she says. First of all, there's no proof that that is an Iranian missile whatsoever. Similar missiles have been made by the Soviet Union, even the North Koreans. Second of all, we're supposed to believe that you can't even get food and medicine into Yemen because of the Saudi blockade. Somehow we're supposed to believe that the Iranians snuck a missile in under somebody's nose. You know, that's pretty hard to believe. But her case is that Iran is violating the Iran agreement by sending these missiles. But the fact is, if that wasn't even an Iranian missile, it would have had to have been sent before the agreement was made. The JCPOA agreement was made anyway, so Iran wouldn't have been in violation for sending a missile that occurred before the agreement. So however you slice it, this little bit of war theater, this little bit of Colin Powell at the UN with his weapons thing is really meant to bamboozle the American people, trying to make a case, a propaganda case, for war with Iran.
And it requires gross distortion, if not outright lies. And it makes me think back at the time when they were building up the animosity against Saddam Hussein and how horrible a person he was. And when I made the case for saying, well, the Iraqis have not committed aggression against us, so you can't say, because they were arguing they're aggressors and they're doing such and such. But I was put down because one member said, hey, Ron, there's something wrong with your argument, because they have been shooting at our airplanes that have been bombing them, you know, and killing them, and brought about this devastation, and they made a feeble worthless attempt at trying to shoot at these airplanes, never hit one, and yet he was using that as the justification, of aggression. And this is the same thing what they're talking about. The Houthis are aggressing against the Saudis. I mean, yeah, a couple of years ago they decided, well, we don't like those Saudis. I guess we'll shoot some missiles up there and see if we can stir up a little trouble. It doesn't quite happen that way.
It's preposterous. When the U.S. argues that its allies, Saudi Arabia and Israel and others, they have a right to defend themselves, which is true. But Yemen is the victim here. Yemen was invaded and attacked by Saudi Arabia in 2015 because the Saudis didn't like the fact that the Yemenis overthrew their government. Well, too bad. But it doesn't justify. I mean, we don't like the idea of missiles flying in any direction. But the fact of the matter is, it's certainly, according to the laws of war, legitimate for Yemen to fire back at Saudi Arabia as Saudi attacks them.
The fact that Haley bombed with her resolution at the UN, what do you think that does? Does that set her back any, or does it set our policy back any? You think it should, but it looks a little bit embarrassing. I would think that would add to the loss of credibility, because you have the credibility of an independent, freedom-loving group of people who go about their way and mind their own business versus somebody who's in charge, and all of a sudden a lot more people are saying, we don't like what you're doing. And they take a vote like this, and it's, 100% voted against the United States.
Yeah, and she threw a fit. She stomped her feet and stomped her hands. But I think what we look for in this case, of course, because the neocons never back down. They should still be hiding their faces in shame over Iraq, but they don't. They have no shame. What we're going to be looking for is more made-up things about Iran and Al-Qaeda. Of course, it's totally illogical that they have any ties. They're mortal enemies. We're going to see more of these kind of smoking gun things over and over, trying to make the case, trying to weaken opposition in the Security Council. But I don't think there'll be any hesitation to go it alone, certainly if the neocons have their way. But they are on extremely shaky legal grounds, even according to the War Powers Resolution. Because the problem for the Trump administration, if this is indeed what they're doing, is shifting toward Iran, the problem with them in Syria is that ISIS is gone. Despite the fact that they tried to save them at the last minute, ISIS is gone, so there's no justification, self-defense justification for us to be there.
Sometimes I think it's deliberate to avoid talking about the real reasons we go into these areas and precipitate war. And instead, there's always an economic reason for it. You remember all the chants when they were talking about going into into Syria. It's all about oil. It's all about the same thing when we went into Iraq. It's all about oil. And there's also a pretty good case made, and I've made it on the House floors quite a few times, that it has to do with the dollar. And the dollar is very important as a reserve currency, and it cannot be dethroned. And most countries have a special interest in that because they all use dollars, because they have them as a reserve. But there are some people who get fed up with it because it gives us a tremendous advantage, because we can export those dollars and buy oil and do all these things. The Saudis cooperated. The petrodollar has carried the day for decades now. And for this reason, there were quite a few people who were making the case when we decided we had to go and take care of Iraq, is that Saddam Hussein toyed with the idea and made a real effort to start paying for his oil in euros. At the time, he was going to just use euros. And the same thing with Gaddafi. Yeah. And you know what happened to them? Well, the Iranians, are interested in that. They've just made an announcement that they're willing to join a group that's promoting the petrodollar, petro yuan, and backed by gold. Whether that goes, someday it will go, or whether they're on the verge of doing it, but they're making an announcement. Iran said they would join us, so our policy has these unintended consequences. Just like one unintended consequence that's glaring is the Shia Crescent. Where did that come from? Was it all Iran's fault that there's a crescent there that probably is very real, but it had nothing to do. It looks like their enemies delivered it to them.
Everything we've done is help them is consolidate the crescent. I guess if you were more cynical, you would say maybe this whole thing is cooked up by the military-industrial complex. Create the Shia Crescent so you can justify more military spending.
Right.
Well, so I think the U.S. is on shaky ground in Syria, And if it wants to repurpose its soldiers, its troops there toward Iran, I think really it is an impeachable offense. If the Democrats are looking for something to impeach Trump on, drop the Russia stuff, look into putting our troops there without any legal justification.
There you go. Hopefully someday. But the national security strategy did come out, and Trump has spoken about it, and Haley is involved, the Iranians are involved, and the enemies are still out there. The military-industrial complex will be very happy. The neocons aren't crying, and they will become or remain very much engaged in this interventionist foreign policy. The national security strategy didn't give any hints that all of a sudden we would become less interventionist. And unfortunately, I think that's not right. We should be moving in the direction of having a serious discussion of revamping our foreign policy and get away from the interventionism and this whole notion that we have this moral responsibility to spread our goodness around the world because it's good for peace and prosperity, it's good to protect our freedoms, and it's good to protect our Constitution. Nothing could be further from the truth. In the meantime, millions of people are dying because of the foreign policy that we have. So we didn't see that there, but there's no reason why we can't continue to talk about it, because quite frankly, if the American people were exposed to two alternatives and two choices that they have on foreign policy and understood what we're talking about and understanding what the neocons are talking about, my bet is that 85% of the American people would say, you know, these wars don't make any sense and we can't afford them anymore. It doesn't enhance our liberties, and look at what they've done to us here at home. So our job is to deliver the message to the American people that non-interventionist is the way to go if you're interested in peace and prosperity. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.